coming from a kind of a reading family, a family that liked to engaged in literature, and was raised in a kind of a rural environment, but we moved a lot. So there was a sense of, my father was a salesman, and there was a sense of transience, and also moving and forming an identity and then carrying it with me to a new place and then starting over again. So feeling kind of on the edge or on the margin during several moments in my childhood, and somewhat alienated from my environments, distanced from them, and from a troubled home. My parents were divorced, and there were issues within that environment. So when I moved into college, I gravitated almost immediately to an identity as a scholar, as someone immersed in literature and books, and I began to acquire a library to define who I was as someone who wasn't what I had been. And that was in the humanities: philosophy, history, literature. I did a triple major in English, philosophy, psychology, and sociology. So in the arts. So I was sort of deeply immersed in the humanities, but also grounded in sociology and psychology, and influenced early on by C. Wright Mills and by Weber, and by Marx and Veblen. Tried to locate and read through American history, American capitalism, the relationship of the U.S. to a larger European global space, and this was the same. This was the early '60s, where my generation was sort of enthralled with existentialism and post-World War II literature, Sartre and Camus, and so we were reading The Stranger and thinking these deep thoughts and being sort of post-war students at a state university in the Midwest, all white campus, being serious intellectuals but not knowing what that was all about, and learning how to write first-person narratives, and sort of drawn, knowing I wanted to go to graduate school, and in sociology, but I'd formed a kind of, out of Mills, a commitment to a first-person biographical approach to doing sociology, writing out of history and my current space, but not knowing what that meant. In sociology at that time at Iowa had nothing on qualitative research. It was all statistics and surveys. So my sort of self-teaching as a graduate student then carried over into my first teaching here, which then led to the writing of the book, The Research Act, which was an attempt to say what happens if you look at methodologies from a particular theoretical framework. But this is still being done under sort of the umbrella of 60s sociology, which was dominated by the competing schools of structured functionalism with Talcott Parsons, logical positivism or positivism from Lundberg and Dodd and Blaylock, and who was emerging on the scene, and then sort of the symbolic interactionists, that school. And they were all, those frameworks were all circulating at the same time. And they sort of get punctured in sociology by Alvin Goulner, who wrote The Coming Crisis of Western Sociology. He just outraged everybody. This was 68, I think, Goulner's book comes out, right at the beginning of the middle of the Vietnam conflict. And the American campuses becoming a site for a counter discourse on the war, coming out of the civil rights movement and the women's movement and the beginnings of gay liberation, and all the liberation movements are sort of circulating in the 60s, in the late 60s as Vietnam heats up, but they're all suppressed within the academy. They're not part of the discourse of the academy. They're marginalized. They're kept out of the classroom. They're present in protests in the quad and in the street, but they're not in the classroom, because the classroom is still sort of governed by the Weberian notion of a value-free, value-neutral discourse. The campus, the classroom is supposed to be a place for knowledge, not values. Fast forward to the present, so after 9/11, when everything blows up or sort of ruptures, and after the stolen election, I decide that, and as we invade Iraq and Afghanistan, this war I'm going to write about. Because you wouldn't have known that we had been in a war if you'd read what I'd written in the 60s and 70s. And somehow I wanted myself, I wanted to insert myself in history. If I was true to Mills, which is what brought me into sociology in the first place, which is to write history and biography together, then how had I left out, how could I justify leaving out the Vietnam experience in my work in that pivotal decade? And of course I couldn't, except to have recourse to this scholarly discipline that said you don't write yourself into your work. Or you do a subjective interpretive sociology, but not of yourself in relationship to the broader historical environment. You just focus on self-concepts and identities and open-ended questions and methodologies that probe those aspects of life, like I did in the Research Act, but you don't bring anything in there that's about history, politics, or the current moment. Through the early 80s, I struggled with my own versions of the same disease my father had, and ended up going into treatment and coming out and have been in recovery for 26 years. But that struggle, that decade that preceded that sort of that experience for me was a decade of sort of profound doubt and feeling that everything I had been taught, I had reached a dead end in terms of, I felt that symbolic interactionism had reached a set of walls. I felt that methodologically we had sort of hit dead ends. And as I'm experiencing that, there on this campus, we form a unit for criticism and interpretive theory, and I'm an early person in that interdisciplinary program, which is still existing to this day. But what we were doing then, this were scholars from a dozen disciplines, but mostly humanities, was reading, this is early, mid-70s, reading all of the post-World War II social theory coming out of Europe that was being translated. French social theory, German social theory, British transformations of continental theory, and so forth. So we were rereading psychoanalysts, we were reading the translations of Heidegger, and Schiller, and Sartre, and Merleau-Ponty, and Shaler. All of that we were reading. Not knowing exactly what we were doing, but we're Lacan, and Barthes, and Derrida. So I was in that space, that really complicated conceptual space, as I'm experiencing this crisis of doubt with sociology, and my own methodology, and my own theory. And everything's coming together and falling apart at the same time. And then I come out of it on the other side with this kind of understanding now that I want to frame a particular formation, a way of doing interpretive work, which I was going to call interpretive interactionism. And then it was going to come out of experiences that made differences in people's lives. That's the place to start. I wasn't going to do ordinary life sociology. I wasn't going to do the kind of social psychology I had been taught in graduate school. I was going to start from experiences that left marks on people's lives and try to articulate a biographical interpretive approach that would be consistent with that commitment, that would be thoroughly informed by all these formations we were reading in this theory group. And so then coming out of that then meant learning to write the new way and learning how to write. So could I write the personal? How would I write the personal? And how would I write myself into the personal? And how would I write the biographical and the autobiographical? And that's been the agenda for the last 25 years. That's been the agenda. An evolving. So now where I am is, we can talk about that, but in my new book, I have moved progressively into the performance text, the multi-voiced text, the text that inserts itself in history and uses multiple perspectives within historical moments, and we can move to that later. But that's been the trajectory when we laid out the 5 or 6 moments of inquiry in the handbook, in the editions. We had the sort of the Geertzian moment. He was profoundly influential here, but with thick description and the crisis of representation and getting the text right, using the text to represent the world, the thick text. Then we moved to the triple crisis, where suddenly we realize that what we're writing is itself part of the problem, and that the Derridian insight that everything is in the text, there's nothing outside the text. The social is always within the text. That then moves Geertz to a somewhat different space, because there's still that sense within Geertz, I think, in the 73 book, that a literary ethnographer, skilled anthropologist, can capture experience in a way that allows others to experience it. So he said we capture experience so it can be re-experienced by others. I'm paraphrasing. Now, Dwight Conquergood, I found in one of the strands of performance ethnography, Conquergood inserts himself in that Geertzian moment and says that it's not representation that we're talking about, because he said that led to inscription, that is writing the social. In fact, Clifford and Marcus' book, Writing Culture, that was the culmination of Geertz's thick description essay. That book was the culmination of that, in a certain sense. So you went from representation to inscription, representation to writing. Writing becomes a way of making the social visible. So when I write performance ethnography, that's an attempt to absorb that literature around the Conquergood assertion that we perform culture. Now, there's another move that's made then, and Henry Giroux makes this, Paulo Freire had made this, that is the pedagogical move. So that is the critical pedagogy move. That what we engage in, so there's 2 strands, what we engage in pedagogically is instruction in the practices of culture. Those practices of culture are ideological and political. So critical pedagogy attempts to interrupt those pedagogical practices that instill a particular political ideology, like a belief in capitalism and democracy and so forth. Because that's critical pedagogy.